So now that the collector's head sculpture was done, it was time to mold it. We start by spraying 3 light coats of matte spray and then letting it dry completely. Next, we lightly spray it with a mold release, which will help us later when removing the clay from the mold. And now we gather our supplies: nitrile gloves, Vaseline, mixing buckets and water, some wet clay, a clay cutter, a spatula, chip brushes, a Sureform, and some sculpting tools. We will also need our hemp fiber for shaping and reinforcing the mold, a bucket of water, and hydrocal, which has similar properties to plaster but is a stronger gypsum cement. So first we grab a little hemp fiber and form what are called bird nests. You just pull a little of it off, roll it around in your hands to form these. We also do a few long skinny ones like this. You'll want to make about 5 of the skinny ones and 8 or 10 of the bird nests. Next, we cut some slabs of wet clay. You can make a cheap clay cutter using 2 pencils or wooden dowels and some fishing line. So cut off about a 1-inch thick slab, then use a spatula and slice off a piece about 1.25 inches wide. Then place this piece a little over 1 inch away from the head like this. Keep cutting and adding slices as you work your way around the sculpture. This will be a retainer wall that will keep the hydrocal from running all over the table. Here I added a small extension and traced a line for the retainer wall. And for fun, I carved in the collector's name in reverse. Then I finished the wall, blended and smoothed the clay a bit, and it was ready to go. I can't stress enough how helpful retainer walls are when making molds. Next, we are going to Vaseline anything that the hydrocal might stick to. I brush a thin film onto the entire flange area around the head, and then a thin coat on the eyes. It is very important to coat these areas or the hydrocal will bond to them and potentially ruin your mold. Okay, our prep work is complete. We have our retainer wall finished, the flange and eyes coated in Vaseline, and we are ready to start the mold. So, it's time to mix up some hydrocal. Okay, wait, stop. Before we go any further, we need to discuss undercuts, one of the most important things to be aware of before making a mold. So an undercut is any spot where a mold can lock with the armature due to an area that steps back beyond a 90-degree angle. Some common undercut danger spots to be aware of are under the chin, behind the corners of the jaw, behind the ears, and even the nostril holes. So pretend this is your clay sculpture on top of your armature and you don't fill in that undercut under the chin with enough clay. Then, when you make your plaster mold, the plaster will fill in under the chin, creating a lock spot. And then when you go to open your mold, it will either lock onto your armature permanently or it will break off pieces of your mold, ruining it. Like how the mold is colliding with the chin in this image. So make sure you have no undercuts before starting your mold. Alright, so now I open the bag and use a small bucket to scoop out some hydrocal powder. When mixing any kind of plaster, you always want to add the powder to the water, never the water to the powder. And you just slowly sift the powder into the water like this. We are starting with a water volume of around 3.5, and it will more than double in volume after we add the hydrocal. This will help you to estimate how much you need for your mold. If you think you need about a half gallon of plaster, then start with a 1/4 gallon of water. So I just keep sifting the powder into the water. It will take at least a few scoops. But soon you'll notice it stops sinking. And I just keep adding a little bit more until we have an island like this. And now I start to mix it. I squeeze out all the lumps, scrape the sides and bottom, and stir it all around. And if it's too watery, I add more hydrocal. You want it to be like a runny pancake batter consistency. You can now see that the volume has more than doubled from 3.5 to 7.5 after we added the hydrocal. So I continue stirring and mixing and really working out all the lumps until it's nice and blended and creamy. And now we start what's called the splash coat or detail coat. You start by splashing and drizzling the hydrocal into the deepest, most detailed spots first, like the mouth slit, the tooth sockets, the wrinkles, and you use a small brush to really get into all those details and work out any air bubbles. You need to work really fast and continue to cover the sculpture, concentrating on the detailed areas first, but ultimately getting everything covered quickly. You'll notice the hydrocal wanting to bead off of areas like the eyes, but don't worry, just keep covering them, and as the hydrocal thickens, it will stick. I'm occasionally banging on the table with my left hand, which burps out the air bubbles and also helps the hydrocal to settle into the deep spots and details. You want to brush it on really good in all directions with enough force to get it into the details and work out air bubbles, but not so hard that you will damage your clay sculpture underneath. Quickly keep working your way around the entire sculpture, getting everything covered before the hydrocal starts to thicken and set up. Now keep scooping out hydrocal with your brush and drizzling it all over the head to start to really build up a good layer. The plaster on your gloves can start to set up and dry out, which can flake off into your mold, so I put on some fresh gloves to finish this step. The hydrocal is thickening up, so now I can scoop some out and finish building up this first layer. When it's at this consistency, you can spread it on in a similar way to frosting a cake. Once it starts to thicken, you have to work extremely fast. In just a minute or two, it will go from pancake batter to mud to a solid. So moving quickly, I keep adding this thick hydrocal to build up a good first layer, covering thin spots and creating about a ½ inch thickness. I really massage it in good to make sure there are no trapped air pockets, and I don't completely fill in the flange area. Air and water temperature can definitely affect the set time, so always do a test batch first. And finally, I rinse my hands in a bucket of water and then do some final smoothing just to blend out any sharp peaks or air pockets that can create problems with the next layer. And here's the finished detail layer. It doesn't need to be pretty because we will now be adding our finish coat. And now we let it cure for a little bit and got ready to start our reinforcement and finish coat. For this layer, we mixed up a slightly larger batch of hydrocal, again really working out all the lumps and blending it well. Then we start by completely wetting down the surface of the first layer. Next, we grab a bird nest, dip it in the water really quick, wring it out, then dunk it in the hydrocal and wring it out. I place it at the top of the head and massage it in really well to eliminate any trapped air pockets. Then I repeat the process and keep covering the mold, overlapping each piece of hemp. It's important to wet the hemp first, as it helps the plaster to penetrate into the fibers. After it's covered in hemp, I do another quick wet coat over the entire thing. So now I grab those thin hemp pieces and I use these to fill in and reinforce the flange area. I just work my way around the entire flange, pushing it in really well and squishing out any trapped air. Then I wet it down with a little more hydrocal. Next, I do a second layer of hemp just to bulk up the overall thickness of the mold. Now I start to create what I call the flat top by taking some hemp nests and building a raised flat plateau on the top of the mold. This flat top is an important step that serves two purposes. Here's a cross section to help explain. This is our hemp layer with the flat top and also our clay retainer wall. Now we can visualize an imaginary dotted line from the corner of the flat top to the corner of the retainer wall, and this becomes your guide for adding more plaster like this to bulk up and create a more uniform thickness to your mold. And the most useful purpose for our flat top is so that when you set the finished mold on the table, it sits flat, allowing you to fill it level with latex. If you make a big round egg mold, it will not sit level and it can roll and spill the latex. So now we are going to start bulking up the mold just like I described in the sketch. While it's still a little runny, I work it into the hemp, and as it starts to thicken, I begin to build it up. Once it starts to thicken, you have to work extremely fast, but now I can really bulk up the sides between the flat top and the retainer wall. As it turns to mud, I actually sculpt with it like clay, building it up and creating the shape of the mold. Again, you have a very small window of time before it turns to a solid, so you have to work extremely fast. Next, I grab a sharp edge sculpting tool to shape and smooth out the surface. And I just quickly work my way around the whole surface of the mold, carving down any clumps and refining the shape. While it is still a bit soft, I carve away any of the overspill on the retainer walls. Then I lift an edge and pull away the clay walls all the way around. Now I grab my Surform rasp and grind away the step and rough edges and continue to clean up the shape. This is much easier to do before the mold is fully cured and hard. The outside of molds don't have to be flawless, but you definitely don't want sharp edges and textures that are hard to handle. And there's our finished mold. So now that it's had time to cure and cool down, let's open it up. I flip it over and use a putty knife to carefully pry it and create a separation. Now I can use a screwdriver and apply a little pressure to pry it up. And because there were no undercuts, it lifted right out. Awesome. Next, I grab the Surform and knock off that sharp edge around the flange to clean it up. Now it's really looking good and will be much easier on your hands. So let's get this clay out. I use a soft, smooth wood tool and start to dig into and pry at the back edge of the clay. Be very careful not to gouge the surface of your mold. Now you can grab the edge and start to pull the clay away from the surface. It should separate easily since we used mold release. And here it comes. Once you get one area loose, the rest will be even easier. Look how the neck just lifts right out. And even the face with all that detail popped out nice and clean. A couple tiny clay nuggets to fish out, but overall it turned out great. And here's some final cleanup tips. Sometimes after using a Surform, little bits of hemp will be sticking out of the mold. Just use a small butane torch, blast those fibers, then dust it off, and you're good to go. And now I'll show you how to patch air bubbles. Get a little of your plaster, some water, and a small brush. First, I dip my brush in water and dampen the areas where the air bubbles are. Now I mix up a tiny bit of hydrocal and water, and I make it pretty runny. Then I get a little bit on the tip of the brush and just dab it right into the air bubbles. Now rinse and wet your brush, and then just brush over those spots, melting them away and blending them into your mold, and they will disappear like magic. Air bubbles are just part of mold making, but with this technique, you'll never have to worry about them again. And ta-da! They're all gone. It's like they were never there. Well, here's the finished collector head mold. It turned out super clean, and it's ready for some latex. There are many different techniques to making molds. This is just my favorite, but I highly encourage you to do some research. Mold making is a skill that requires practice to master. Remember, the most important thing is that the inside turns out well. The outside doesn't have to be pretty, but it should be clean and functional with a nice flat top to sit level for casting. Well, I sure hope this guide has been helpful. Thanks again so much for watching. We'll see you soon.